Welcome to Norman's Orchid YouTube channel, and today I'm going to talk about and share with you how to water the orchid in moss. And I started the business in 1986 when I graduated from Cal Poly Pomona. I have a degree in horticulture, minor in chemistry, and I also specialize in plant tissue culture. And most of you might think this water is very easy, but most of you actually, the easiest way to kill an orchid is actually overwater. And this is the perfect example of two exactly identical plants. They are clone. Okay, the one on the right hand side has been watered properly and grow beautifully, and now have double spikes coming up. The one on the, is a duplicate of this one clone. It's a perfect example of overwater. In fact, most of the people, whether you got a first orchid from the supermarket or as a gift from your friend, most likely the orchid, the Phalaenopsis, the moth orchid, will be coming in growing in the moss. And the reason moss, this is actually a special Spanish moss, specially grown, whether it's from Brazil, or from New Zealand, or from Chile. It's a very choice of moss for growing Phalaenopsis because they hold a lot of water, and it's good for the grower who's marketing them. They can ship in long distance without drying the polymedia versus the orchid bark that can dry out, or in the retail situation. And this is a perfect example of overwater. And I'm actually going to show you what happened in the plant when you overwater. Okay, I'm going to take this out. This is the plant when they overwater. You see here, the plant did not got to dry out. I'm going to leave this one here versus the one was healthy. And this is wet too. But Jeff, can you focus on the leaf? Notice that the root is healthy and green. Okay, see the difference? Okay, so I'm going to show you why caused this and the proper way for growing orchid. So regardless of what you have learned on growing other plant, the Boston fern, any house plant, orchid grow in the moss, for example. The moss is just a sponge. They hold a lot of water when they're wet. Okay, they are just a sponge. They hold 40 times the water as they dry wet. But it takes longer time for them to dry out. Okay, so once they dry out, they actually give a lot of air space to the root. Okay, so what happened is this is the case of constantly wet. And I also want to advise you, never use the ice cube. Okay, even the people who grow and promote the ice cube, and they do not grow their orchid with ice cube. They grow it in water. Okay, so ice cube is a good way to kill your orchid in the long term. It's a good idea, a cute marketing idea, because lots of the housewives, when they're in the supermarket, it's an impulse item. And the most people are wondering, how do I water orchid? The minute they saw the text say, oh, just add 3 ice cubes, everybody can do 3 ice cubes. It might be okay in the long term, in the short term, but in the long term, they're going to kill the orchid root, just like that plant earlier. So, how do I know, and how do you know when to water your orchid in moss? Okay. This is an example of very wet moss. Okay, the moss, when they are wet, they're very dark color. You can also, in fact, the moss is actually very easy even for the beginner, because versus 30 years ago when we used to grow orchid in the Douglas fir bark, for example, it's always hard to gauge the orchid in the bark because they're always so light to begin with, even when you water them because they're so coarse. But the orchid in the moss, when they are wet, you can lift it. They're heavy versus the orchid are drier. They are lighter in weight. And this is the perfect example of the moss. Different than the bark or potting soil, for example. If you orchid in the bark or potting soil, they dry from the top to the bottom. Okay, very important. The one in the moss, they dry from the bottom and up. So the easiest way, we always do tell our customer, check your water once a week. Doesn't mean that you have to water once a week. Okay, you just check the water. So just take it out from the decorative pot or the moss pot and do a visual inspection. This is if the potting moss is wet like this and heavy. This one, for example, is still moist because it's still very moist. And you put your finger at the bottom, and right in the center is still very moist. So actually, I'm going to skip this week. You actually can do it next week. And that's the beauty about the moss. You don't have to water every week, okay? On the contrary, when the moss is dry, they turn very white versus dark. And they're also very, very light. And in theory, the smaller the pot, the faster they dry out. So if you have a 2.5-inch pot like this, they're going to dry out faster than the big one. Okay, so this is perfect. Now, once you have the plant like this dry and really light, there's a two-way to do it. You can take it to the sink and water from the bottom. Okay, so this is why then it drain. And you do double water. This is why you don't want to do ice cube. The ice cube, as they melt, is very, very cold, and they will shock the root system. The Phalaenopsis, the plant genetically from the tropical Asia, the Philippines, Indonesia. Where it come from? Their growing environment is very hot and humid and warm. So you're going to kill the root if you put ice cube with the root system. So take it to the sink and do double water like this, and let it drain. You can put it, okay? Now, there's also possible a plant like this. This is now light as feather. And that's the beauty about the moss. You can, this one haven't been watered for 3 weeks. Now, this is not going to, when they become totally dry and totally white, it's very hard to re-wet. One way to do this is what we call soaking. You can actually let it soak in the water and let it sit. I usually like to do 1 cup per plant. Okay, try not to do 1 bucket for the entire collection of your orchid. What happens is, if one guy have problem with a root disease, like that one earlier, have all the root rot. Okay, picture this. I have all the root rot. This root rot pathogen is going to be in the water as you soak it the plant by plant. Then every plant is going to get disease. So it's best to have just 1 cup and let it sit, and they will pick up from the bottom. And we're going to let it sit for 5 minutes. And when I'm doing this, okay, This is the one we water earlier by hand earlier. You see, once they're wet, they stay very, very wet, become very dark in color. Okay, so here's another perfect example of the bigger pot. When I check this, when I lift this out, I know it can need to be water because it's really light versus the heavy one like this. Okay, and you notice the color. The top here always going to be darker because those are the ones that stay wet all the time. This becomes white now. Try not to let them turn white all the way up, otherwise it will become very hard to re-wet. And when they're that dry, all the way up white, they can take it because there's lots of moisture inside the crown of it. So when they become, the easiest way is when you see the color become lighter in its color by half, okay, the gauges by half, then you can water them. And again, take it to the sink, to the tap water, and let them drain. And especially, I want to see them drain from the bottom. Keep doing this. It will wash out any of the extra fertilizer or the salt from the tap water, for example, will leach out. So this is very good for the plant. Then this is also ensure that they got wet all the time and all the way. So it's actually good to have let them slightly dry in between. So with the moss, the easiest way to kill the plant in the moss is to overwater them. So it's best depending on your area. Sometimes if you live in Pacific Northwest or Northeast during the winter time, the day is short, the weather is cooler, so you might have in the moss, you check it every week. Okay, it's so dark, pass on to next week. Okay, and then just put it back to your area. So this is the same one that we saw earlier. It's really fast. When they are dry like this, the easiest way to re-wet them is by soaking. And then even then when they are wet already, we are still going to water from the top. Okay, because once they are wet, then we can do what we call the leaching. It's very essential to let the water drip from the top all the way down to the bottom to wash out any excess salt or fertilizer in there. Okay. So this is actually the most simple way of growing orchid in the moss. Is less is more in moss. Okay, check water once a week. If they are still all wet like this, skip it. Put all your 2-inch pot in one all together because those are the smaller the pot, they're going to dry out faster, whether it's in moss or bark. Okay. Now what about feeding them? In general, we feed them with our own special, our own brand of fertilizer. I custom brand of this fertilizer when I was in college, and everything is in there. A micronutrient. We was formulated initially at Cal Poly Pomona, and then when I was doing tissue culture at UC Riverside, so I also do refine the formulation in vitro in a test tube, so I can really refine and see how do a tissue analysis, see what they like as a in vitro and also in the greenhouse. So in general, this is a very concentrated fertilizer, Norman Fang Optimum fertilizer. We use only a small teaspoon. So this is very concentrated. It goes a long way. A teaspoon per gallon of water, and you feed them every other week. The plant, as long as they have photosynthesis, have light, they can use the nutrient. With the moss, you actually pour it into a diluted solution into the fertilizer, and trying to use this and pour it in that way do the watering and run through. And this is why I want to show you how refined you can see how refined this powder. Okay, this is very, very refined, almost a powder sugar-ish. That means that we take up, this is the purest ingredient we can use. The next level is reagent grade, and reagent grade you can do pharmaceutical. So this is, you will never see tip burn on your orchid, and it will take out all the impurities, so they will not damage your sensitive root tip on this. Okay, so then we water them every other week. Check the water once a week. You feed them fertilizer every other week. What happens when the fertilizer, the moss is still wet? The fertilizer is so refined that you can actually do what we call the foliar feeding. Not every fertilizer can do foliar feeding, so you can actually make a solution, and especially if you go under light. Under light usually have minimum 12 hours. This, you can do foliar feeding on the plant, especially when plants are in flower. There's a myth that if they are in flower, you don't need to feed them. That's wrong, because especially plant orchid lasts for flower for a long time, they're going to need a lot of nutrients that to input them. And this is why if you don't feed them during this blooming season, sometimes they might skip next year. And this is why it's essential you feed them. We eat 3 meals a day. So in orchid, we only feed them twice a month. So it's very essential. So on the water like this, so make sure you always water early in the day. Do not let the water still stay in the ground overnight. If you have to stay overnight, make sure you tilt it. Okay. And then if your air circulation, if you only have 1 or 2 orchids, you do not have a setup with a fan. Just use a tissue paper and just wipe it up dry in the center. Okay. So this is the orchid simplify. This is how we grow our orchid in Southern California, and we have over 20 greenhouses. And when you buy orchid, a healthy orchid should be like this, nice and firm. You see the foliage. The foliage should be nice, good color. A good root system like this, a nice strong stem, so support and good branching habit. And this is the trick. And also, if you have more orchid, you can actually invest in the Mega Dry. It's a wonderful, wonderful element in there. It has got lots of the micronutrient and enzyme that can stimulate the plant on production of hormone. So you also do the foliar application once a month on that. Okay, so this will be conclude the orchid water in the moss simplify, and I will do another session later on how to repot orchid in the moss. Okay, well, thank you for joining me. Thank you very much, and please subscribe Norman's Orchid channel at YouTube. So in the future, when I do another culture talk like this, you have got notified. All right, thank you.